there's nothing but hubris from central bankers and the people in charge. It's people who swear they know best. But at this point, financially, monetarily, they've convinced America to jump out of a plane without a parachute. And they're saying, no, well, you haven't hit the ground. It's okay. It's okay. But it's not going to be okay when we hit the ground. People can even less so afford basic necessities like food and housing and transport. And this is an inevitable feature, an inevitable end to what is a giant monetary experiment that's been conducted on all of us without any of our permission.
Welcome back to RTD Interviews. Today I'm excited to have a returning guest, Mr. Jp Cortez, the Executive Director of the Sound Money Defense League, a nationally known group that passionately promotes the stable and constitutional role of sound money. Today, JP joins you to provide updates and analysis on the latest events happening around the country, with states opting back into sound money by reestablishing gold and silver into the people's hands. So, JP, welcome back to RTD Interviews.
Mike, it's so good to be here, man. Thank you for having me back.
Yes, I appreciate you taking time to join me. And so it's been a minute since we've last connected. I see that you guys are extremely busy as I follow you on Twitter, and lots of good things happening in our country nowadays outside of all the other things happening. But definitely looking forward to finding out some key bills that's underway right now in different states. But for those who may not know you, if you don't mind, give us a little bit of your background and how you've arrived at this point in your career.
So like you said, my name is Jp Cortez. I'm the Executive Director of the Sound Money Defense League. I grew up generally pretty apolitical, skeptical, I suppose, but not super involved or interested in politics. It wasn't until I got to Auburn University, where I got my undergrad degree, that I discovered Austrian economics, libertarianism, freedom, and sound money, ultimately sound money. And so when I graduated, I linked up with Stephen Gleason, who is a operator of Money Metals Exchange, a large a national precious metals dealer. And he wanted to start and fund a sound money policy project. Being in the field gave him a front row seat to understanding, wait, there are states that still charge taxes on gold and silver when you buy it and when you sell it. And there are restrictions on dealers, and states aren't allowed in many cases to even invest state funds in gold and silver. So we linked up and we saw that, there's a lot legislatively that could be done to promote sound money, to remonetize gold and silver. Because the truth is, we don't choose the US dollar because it's a great monetary instrument. Maybe it has benefits, but largely the reason we choose the US dollar is because we're kind of trapped there. There are restrictions and taxes and all sorts of disincentives on pretty much any other viable option for use as money. So we're going around state to state and to DC, removing all of this friction, all of the briar that stands in the way of people investing and saving in constitutional money, gold and silver, but also in entrepreneurs and the industry moving forward with advancements in money, in fractional money, in digital money. Removing all of the impediments that stand in the way allows entrepreneurs to create and discover the best form of money.
Sounds good. Appreciate you for sharing that. And so definitely looking forward to finding out more updates. And so just a little flashback into the past. Our first discussion here back in 2022 received quite well here, and it was entitled, States Opting Back Into Sound Money. And that was when I was introduced to the basically Sound Money Defensive League and seeing how good of a work you guys are doing there. But, for where we're at right now, lots of pressing things on the forefront. CPI figures, inflation's ticking back up as always. We have gold in all-time highs and all the other geopolitical events the world's facing now. But from where you're seated at now, I guess, what are one or two things that concerns you the most, that really fuels your passion to help get gold and silver back into people's hands?
I think a big part of it is something you just mentioned, these recent CPI numbers. For months now, I know Money Metals and some of the other players in this precious metal space have been reporting on revisions, the very liberal use of revisions that government officials have been doing to job numbers, to inflation numbers. It just so happens that every month on release, these numbers will paint a very rosy picture, and the news headlines will say, wow, Biden's job numbers surprising everyone. And then under the cloak of night, you'll see maybe a couple of weeks or a month later, you'll see that the official numbers have been revised downwards. And if that happens once, that's an accident. These are obviously predictions. They're hard to calculate and be accurate on. But this is a trend of revisions constantly, frequently, virtually every time being revised downwards, so as to originally present a very favorable picture of the state of the US economy, and then later fudging these numbers to what they actually are. For example, we've seen some of the numbers. I think Zero Hedge did something on this morning about gas prices. I travel a lot. I'm on the road a lot with the sound money legislation, and so I've seen gas prices around the country, and it's undeniable that they're going up. This is gas, food. These are things that are undeniably going up. If you've looked at a gas station sign, if you've walked into a grocery store, you can see that this is the case. And then you have these government numbers that are painting a lie. It's not sleight of tongue. It's not, a little error in calculation. It is an active lie that the government officials are cooking government numbers. And this is something you hear about, this happens in North Korea, or this happened in the Soviet Union. This is actively happening here in the United States, where government officials are lying about the state of the economy. And, going into an election year, that is only going to worsen.
Right. I do agree. And as you were mentioning about lies about, statistics, I mention all the time how, literally you can't trust the same entity they have a lot to lose. So literally it's in their best interest to pad the books per se with revisions that come about too often. But one thing they can't hide happens to be, the ever increasing national debt. And so we're approaching $35 trillion. And that number there to me is just as concerning as the day-to-day consumer price index we're given. And so with this figure here, how much do you think it has impacted politicians' decisions, perhaps in deciding to really move forward on some of these bills that you guys are a part of?
On the state level, I think it has a tremendous impact. There are state politicians. The truth is there are more than 8,000 elected state politicians in the United States. Many of them have never heard the term sound money. Many of them have never asked those questions about, wait, why do we use money? What does the best form of money look like? What is the reason behind all this? Where does money derive its value? Questions like that are not often asked. And on the federal level, you can see how there is not even the impression of having that be a concern. The feds have relegated themselves to practicing in practice what is modern monetary theory. The inflation doesn't matter, the deficits don't matter, the government debt doesn't matter. And you're seeing on the federal level how this is obviously something that they're practicing. Maybe giving lip service, the occasional politician giving lip service to being on an unsustainable fiscal course. But largely you see with, these politicians might say things like this, and then but what's another 60 billion for Israel, or what's another 100 billion for Ukraine, and what's another so like for all of the lip service, for all of the verbal affirmation that politicians may occasionally give the importance of this issue, they very much are not practicing that. So on the state level, you're right, it's huge, because in many cases state politicians are certainly closer to everyday Americans like you and me, and the people in Lincoln, Nebraska, or Nashville, Tennessee, or Madison, Wisconsin. Those people have their fingers on the pulse of their people far more than the people in suits and ties thousands of miles away in DC trying to legislate from afar. So yeah, the people in the states are obviously very aware of these issues. You've got Paul Krugman, who recently published an article about how, the inflation numbers, or rather I think it was Justin Wolfers, an economist from Michigan, I believe, or out of the University of Michigan, who wrote this New York Times article about how, people seem to be very down on the economics, despite the fact that government numbers say that the economy is great. Why are people seemingly so sad or down about the state of the economy? And it's because people have eyes. It's because these are the people walking into grocery stores and trying to feed their families or pay their rent or buy a car to get them to and from work. So on the state level, it's very pertinent. And I think go back to your last question about one or two things that makes you worry about all of this. I think one thing that I have been chewing on lately that has been resonating with me a lot lately is it's all lies. And not just in the sense of what we were just talking about in the revisions math sense of lies, in the statistical sense of a quote unquote lie, but I'm talking about inflation as a whole, right? The same people that told you that their plan would bring no inflation, that they spoke to all respected economists. So that first they told you there would be no inflation. Inflation started and they told you there was no. Then they told you it was transitory. Then they told you it was Putin's fault. Then it was what's happening in Iran, Taiwan. Then it became the fault of your grocery store's CEOs. And so it's a constant shifting of blame all over, when it just requires a little bit of thought. I think, there's only one institution with their hands on the lever. There's only one institution or group that can control the supply of money, the variable things that go into the value, the purchasing power of our money. It's not Putin. It's not China. It's not whoever Elizabeth Warren, whatever entrepreneur Elizabeth Warren feels like blaming on that given day. Inflation is a policy choice. This is an active, intentional act by the government to devalue your dollars. It's the principles of dilution. And the government is pretending that these principles don't exist or pretending that they don't understand them. But in any case, it's the Americans that are having to use the dollars that are ultimately harmed by this. It's the Americans that are trying to save for retirement or buy a home that ultimately, the wage earners, the people on fixed incomes, these are the people that inflation absolutely smashes. And instead of taking responsibility for their actions, instead of saying, wait, hang on, maybe we got this wrong, maybe printing 40% of America's money supply in the course of 18 months and injecting that into the economy, maybe that does have an effect on general price levels. And so there's nothing but hubris from central bankers and the people in charge. It's people who swear they know best. But at this point, financially, monetarily, they've convinced America to jump out of a plane without a parachute. And they're saying, no, well, you haven't hit the ground. It's okay. It's okay. But it's not going to be okay when we hit the ground. And when more than it already is happening, people can even less so afford basic necessities like food and housing and transport. And this is an inevitable feature, an inevitable end to what is a giant monetary experiment that's been conducted on all of us without any of our permission.
Very true there. And so, man, you dropped a lot of interesting nuggets there. And so I think with all the hubris and, the lies and the revaluations, recalculations, all the things that's been thrown our way, I think it's becoming more and more obvious how much of a failed experiment this is really turning out to be, to where, you have the Jerome Powell's narrative of, a landing. Like, when you're comparing the global macro economy that's been held up by the reserve currency of the Federal Reserve note system, and you're talking about a landing. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to be too doom and gloom, but given what's at stake here, I like to refer to the fact that it's more likely going to be like a crash and burn scenario that will lead to a restructuring, a reboot of the system because of how much debt there is, and ultimately the weaponization of our currency here. And so one thing I love to highlight is this little visual aid here, basically just signaling how much purchasing power has been lost over the last 111 years since the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And so as of right now, we've had 19 administrations, and the current one now, Mr. Biden, might be the last of its kind, because now we got the CBDC talk coming about and things of that nature. But I think the true indicator of where things are heading happens to be reflected in the actual price of gold. And so right now, with gold at an all-time high, could you ever imagine, or just put yourself back in the shoes of, say, our great-grandparents or something like that, when, an ounce of gold was $20 or $35 or whatever, they decided to reevaluate it too. But now it takes 2,300 pieces of paper for 1 ounce. So
Right.
that, to me, that says how bad things are on a global scale. But I guess at this current moment now, with the price of an ounce of gold steadily climbing, or the amount of papers needed to purchase it being debased rapidly, I also imagine that happens to get the attention of a lot of politicians that you're probably coming in contact with when you're talking about policies and bills of that nature. Wouldn't you say, or no? What are you thinking?
Absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's putting it the way you put it there is so important. And I think it's something that isn't necessarily natural, or like, yeah, it's not natural to think that way, because, like you said, gold is at 2,300 ish right now. We're at all-time highs. But an ounce of gold has always been an ounce of gold. And so when priced in the native currency being itself, an ounce of gold is an ounce of gold. It's not that an ounce of gold has increased utility so much, or that it's changed. It's that when priced in this dying currency, it requires more individual units of that currency to buy the same thing that $35, like you said, bought 100 years ago. And yeah, I think understanding, sort of, we're seeing it, and it's everywhere. There's doubt creeping in as to the stability of the global economy, the American economy, certainly. Questions about consumer debt levels and credit card delinquencies all over. Questions about Jerome Powell and that gang is going to do to interest rates. And yeah, so state legislatures are very keenly aware of what's going on, because it's undeniable, partly because it's undeniable. But The reality is that for all this dysfunction that's going on in the world economy, in financial markets here in the United States, this is largely a failing of the Feds, the Federal Reserve, and federal policies increase or encourage deficit spending and things like that. So while the states themselves are not necessarily responsible for that giant debt clock that you had pulled up just a minute ago, states themselves are starting to realize, wait, hang on, but we don't have to stand idly by while this continues happening to not only the people in our state, which obviously they care for, they're citizens of the state, they're taxpayers of the state, but also the state coffers themselves. States are looking at their balance sheets, what their state funds are invested in many cases, hundreds of millions of billions of dollars, depending on what state you're in. And in many cases, states are not even allowed to own physical gold and silver on their state balance sheets. In most states, the state investment is typically guided or governed by a list that the state has put together of permissible investments. And typically those permissible investments tend to be cash substitutes, commercial debt, paper debt. And these are all dollar-denominated debt instruments. Because they're dollar-denominated debt instruments and because inflation is so high, in many cases, these have negative real rates of return. Because if you're telling me that you're returning 4% on your government investment, but inflation is probably closer to 7 or 8%, what you're telling me is that you're losing 4% every year. So making that argument, going state to state, going to legislators, going to investment boards and state treasurers, the officials that make these billion-dollar decisions, and having conversations with them, the difference between, chasing returns, if that is your sole concern, that's a dangerous game to play. There's no regard for counterparty risk, right? So that's one of gold's, I think, chief benefits, is that an ounce of gold is the extinguisher of debt, whereas a $100 bill is an IOU, right? There is the counterparty to US dollars is the federal government. And if the federal government either goes under or hyperinflation happens, that dollar will not be worth anything anymore. So you have the risk of the counterparty, the issuer of the note. You have the risk that they do something bad, that they inflate their currency away. You have all of these risks. With things like gold, these are final settlement payments. There is no counterparty risk. An ounce of gold is the value that it says it is, whereas US dollars are not. They are paper IOUs. And so states are waking up to this, and they're starting to introduce and even pass, in some cases, legislation to empower their state treasurer to protect their state funds in gold and silver. And that's happened across the country. Famously, the Texas Bullion Depository in 2017, they established a depository to protect the state's funds because the state at the time had about $1 billion worth of gold in a pension fund, a teacher pension fund that the state ran. And other states have done this as well. Texas has done it, like I mentioned. Ohio also has about $1 billion, I believe, in their fire and police pension fund. Tennessee last year passed legislation empowering their state treasurer to invest state funds. And then just last week, the governor of Utah signed a bill that we've been working on with Representative Ken Ivory, who, a little bit of sound money lore, Representative Ken Ivory was the representative who carried the original 2011 Sound Money Act in Utah that really jump-started this whole sound money state legislative movement. So he's still in the legislature, and we've been working with him, and we just had a bill signed in Utah that would enable the treasurer to invest in gold. It also calls for a study to determine how else gold and silver might be incorporated into Utah's financial system to better protect the taxpayers and the tax coffers of the state of Utah. And that's just one. There's states that are considering this all over the country. So yeah, as the risk of potential financial global collapse increases, the scales fall from the eyes of people who believe the government lies about what money is and about how stable the US dollar is, and that believed all the nonsense when the Federal Reserve and its officials were going on TV saying things like, in a post-crash environment, we'll never see another economic crash in our lifetimes, is what these people were saying. And so it looking past that hubris and being able to see, wait, hang on, Utah in this case, or in the case of any individual state, Utah has a vested and a fiduciary responsibility to think about itself, of its taxpayers, and they're waking up to that. And so not only is it just states investing in physical gold and silver, while that is true and they are doing that, they're also allowing individuals to invest in gold and silver, making it easier for you or me or someone in that state to adopt their own personal gold standard.
Interesting there. Now, I want to dive a little bit more in depth with some of the actual activities within the states. And so based upon everything that's happening across our country, of course, people can go find out more in full detail over at your guys' website here. But based upon all the articles and the policies out there, approximately how many states have already adopted something that is very favorable? And of course, there's different measures of adoption, whether it be, I guess, whether it's, ending sale taxes, ending capital gains, or establishing depositories. And so there's different, on the books there. But I guess give us a broad view of some of the most impactful that can really make a difference for residents within those states, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important part. What you just said right there. How can we create the most impact for people in the state wanting to readopt gold and silver as money? And so we thought about it for a long time, and the route that we decided to go down as the Sound Money Defense League is the one about taxes, right? There are bills that deal with things like legal tender status, things that deal with sort of niche or nuanced concepts or ideas that we obviously support. And, all of this is the idea of legal tender in the United States. It goes back hundreds of years, since before the Civil War, and even before that, Marco Polo. So legal tender is historically something that's been around for a long time. But what we have found, or what we have decided, the conclusion that we came to is the biggest thing keeping people from using gold and silver as money is not necessarily its legal tender status in any given state. It's the actual friction that goes into using gold and silver as money. So right now, there are 44 states in the country that have ended the sales tax on gold and silver. We're supposed to find out news on Kentucky, who has a bill pending right now. We're working to override a veto. So hopefully Kentucky will become the 45th state in the country here in the next couple of days. But so in those remaining, not counting Kentucky, in those 5 remaining states, when you walk into a bullion dealer or a pawn shop, you're going to get hit with a sales tax. When you buy a gold eagle or a gold bar or a silver round, whatever it is, the state is going to charge you a sales tax on it. So that introduces friction, right? You're paying a premium over the item, more than the premium that's already included in the item. So the government is taking its cut. Okay, that makes it tough to use as money, because if you're going to acquire it, you have to pay taxes on it. In more, I think it's 37 states that still charge the state income tax on gold and silver, a couple of which are also aligned or are the same as those sales tax states where the policy is to tax the purchase. You're getting taxed when you buy the metals. And then again, when you sell the metals, if there's any capital gain, you're being taxed again by the state, and then again by the feds, actually. So in those states, you're being taxed 3 times. So the reason gold and silver are not used as money in those states isn't because of its status as legal tender or whatever it is. It's because there's so much friction in this financial transaction that it becomes unworkable as money. So to remove the taxes on money, on gold and silver constitutional money, is our primary priority. And to that end, I'm happy to say that, like I mentioned, 44 states in the country have eliminated this tax. Like I mentioned, Kentucky has one pending with the governor. New Jersey is also expected to consider ending this and has a good chance to do so this year. So states all over are eliminating the sales tax, eliminating the barrier that stops people from buying precious metals if they wanted to do that. There are also states that are introducing and passing legislation to end the capital gains tax. I'm happy to say that just yesterday in Nebraska, we've been working on a bill to end the capital gains tax. And in Nebraska, they're unicameral. That means their legislature only has one body, whereas normal legislatures have a House and a Senate. But in Nebraska, it's just the Senate. So we introduced a bill there. And actually, there's some other stuff in that bill that I think you might be interested in, Mike. It's the capital gains bill, of course, but it's also a bill that says CBDCs are not money in the state of Nebraska. We will not accept them as money. You cannot impose them to be used as money on the people of Nebraska. This is modeled after legislation that has passed. Governor DeSantis down in Florida signed a bill like this into law. A North Carolina House also passed a legislation like this. And there are other states that are actively and increasingly. Tennessee recently also passed an anti-CBDC law. On top of restoring sound money and making it easier for people to use, we're also playing defense against bad money, government money, that the Federal Reserve or any other arm of the government might try to impose on citizens of any given state. And we've seen, and we are familiar with the risks of CBDC, the obvious privacy risks that come with having all of your transactions tracked by a government, or obviously the tether that is now tied to your ability to exercise your rights. We've seen a good example, the trucker convoy in Canada, where the government said, you were protesting in favor of something that I don't like, and so I'm going to completely cut you off from the financial system. And that risk is huge. And we're seeing it, people fighting for liberty in Canada. We've seen a government turn on them and use the power of the financial strings to drop that hammer on them. We see it in Africa, where women are fighting against police brutality and police sexualization. And instead of being able to use money as a neutral good to be able to support the things you want to support or cast dispersion on things you don't like or don't want to support. Instead, the government now has their finger on the scale, deciding where you can and can't spend money, how you can and can't use your money to support certain causes. And the risk, the potential risk there is massive. You know, we've seen here in the United States, I just went through 4 years of President Trump hearing that this guy was literally Hitler, and you want to give literally Hitler the power to completely financially disarm, dismember whoever they want to. That's crazy. Joe Biden also we should have very huge hesitations about giving an octogenarian who can't tie his shoes the power to just completely disconnect an unfavored group from America's financial system. So CBDCs have obvious massive risks to them, and states are waking up to that, and they're saying absolutely not. We will not do it. And it's not just the states. We're working with Congressman Mooney in DC. And I know that I believe Ted Cruz has also introduced language to go ahead and kill CBDCs on the federal level. So on every level of governance in the state and the federal level, we're seeing little pockets that still understand freedom and that still understand the risks that CBDCs pose.
Great analysis there. So you did a good job covering the CBDCs, because that was my next question was going to be, what are your thoughts on that? So definitely between the pro sound money policies and the anti-CBDC policies that are being rolled out, that's very favorable for now. And so hopefully, more people are able to get a hold of this information and really understand the importance of sound money while they still have a chance to actually get a hold of some at a semi-affordable rate, because the longer they hold on to those fiat notes, as I like to always use a demonstration here, the more you're going to have to spend to get back into sound money. So I always encourage people to redeem notes for sound money, and you'll be okay financially speaking. So
I think
go ahead.
I'm sorry, you just hit on something that I find really important that I don't think a lot of people think on. And that's like the nature of this financial system, the nature of a central bank that prints unbacked currency creates what I have called a US dollar holder's trilemma. So you have three options. You're narrowed down to only three options, and none of them are really good options for you. In this system with increasing inflation, where the government can just simply print money whenever it wants, you can either save the money and get hit with the inflation tax. Your dollar will not go further if you hold it over the long term, as the purchasing power of your money gets zapped. So you can save it at a cost. You can spend it, try to get the most out of your purchasing power. And those are the kind of things that incentivize hyper-consumerism and generally devalue our society. Or you can try to invest it and try to understand the risky stock market casino that is investing in mutual funds and ETFs and sort of these financial instruments that no one really understands. With this system of money, those are your only three options, and they're all bad options. So destroying this system, this antiquated system that regularly steals from people, both actively and in more insidious, quiet ways, is the utmost priority. Creating competition in money and letting markets decide what make good money, not by edict, not by executive order, but by market forces, I think ultimately is how good money is restored.
All right, good point there. Now, as we draw towards the end, I want to bring attention to the Sound Money Index that you guys put together here. And so if you don't mind, give us a little bit of insight as to what you guys are tracking and how the viewers can perhaps, also plug into this just to see where things are progressing as we move forward, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. The Sound Money Index, this is the 2024 version that we've released earlier this year. We've been doing this, I believe, the last 7 years. We've released a scorecard. And so what the index is we're ranking all 50 states using a number of different criteria to determine which state has the best pro-sound money environment in the country. So using criteria, like you mentioned, tax on gold and silver, general sales tax rates, whether a state has reaffirmed gold and silver as money, whether it's established an in-state depository, whether it's invested any state funds in physical gold and silver held within the state, whether it's issued gold bonds. And there are a number of other criteria. So those are just a few. I believe now we're up to 14 different pieces of criteria that we measure, just using the different policies that each state has. And it's been really interesting to see how states have moved up and down the index over the years as so for example, Wyoming is a state that's been towards the top of the index since 2018. And that's before that, it was a middling state on the sound money issue. And then in 2018, it passed a bill that we worked on, House Bill 103, with the late Representative Roy Edwards, who was a champion for sound money. And with that one bill, you saw Wyoming shoot up towards the top of the charts. With Texas having a bullion depository, you have them shooting up. And so I was mentioning to you off camera before we got started here, I think at this point we're tracking 64 pieces of legislation across 26 states, I believe. So these states are constantly moving up and down the index. And you see the states that gravitate towards the top, like I mentioned, Utah, South Dakota, Texas, Tennessee has been huge recently, passing a number of pro-sound money laws over the last couple of years. And then you see the states that fall to the bottom. You've got your Minnesotas, your New Jerseys, your Vermonts. Kentucky is a state that is surprisingly really bad on sound money to this point.
Really?
Yeah, and I think that actually highlights an important point, that sound money is not a partisan issue. You know, I've worked with legislators in really blue states to enact and pass successful legislation. And I have fought tooth and nail in really red states over the course of several years in some cases to try to get this sound money legislation passed in what you would think would be something that would resonate with quote unquote red states. But it doesn't seem, the public policy on sound money doesn't seem to fall along ideological or political lines. Inflation is something that is affecting virtually everyone across the country. And so states, blue and red, are waking up to this, and they're trying to find ways to halt the progress of this dysfunctional federal policy.
Yeah. Well, JP, man, I appreciate you taking time to educate us and get us caught up on latest activities happening around the country. And definitely it looks very positive, very promising to say the least, that there are people out there at the state level, especially, that want to actually help their residents out. So I will definitely keep an eye on this as always. And for those who want to find out more, I'll put on the screen here your page here where people can go find out more. And that's at Jp Cortez 27. And you do a good job of keeping everybody up to date. So I appreciate you and your efforts for sound money, man, because I'm a sound money enthusiast, and clearly you are too. And it's a good fight worth fighting because it helps people preserve and protect everything they've worked hard for by taking it back in their own hands in physical form. So thank you for your efforts, my friend. Any last thoughts you want to leave us with?
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's always great talking to you. Yeah, I want to leave with one thing that I think I've been making an effort when I'm speaking at events or speaking on podcasts. I want to encourage everyone within the sound of my voice to please be an active participant in your legislature. The truth is, in DC, you don't have much power. You can call the Capitol switchboard if you want. An intern might or might not answer the phone. That intern might or might not give the message to the congressperson you were meaning to contact. And that, if that message is delivered, it probably ends up filed in some box that no one ever looks at. That's the reality of the gridlock that is DC. But the truth is that that's not the case in Columbus, Ohio, or in Nashville, Tennessee, or in Des Moines, Iowa. You have power in your state legislature. And ultimately, all of these successful legislative projects that we've been working on, the not so secret sauce to their success is grassroots pressure. It's us contacting and mobilizing people in the state to contact key members of legislatures or key members of committees, because DC is used to getting giant influxes of calls and having their switchboards blown up. But when you're calling Lincoln, Nebraska, and there are 20 or 30 people calling, telling them to support a piece of legislation, that speaks volumes to legislators in that state because they're not used to that kind of pressure. So please, the Sound Money Defense League, soundmoney.org, you'll see a form on our front page where you can put your email address and your zip code. The reason we ask for your zip code is because we section these lists off by state in our system. So for example, yesterday when Nebraska had that hearing on this bill, we sent out a blast to 3,000 email addresses in Nebraska with the contact information for the key people, making it very easy for people to show their voice, to raise their voice in support of sound money in the state. So my last thought is I encourage you to please sign up for our list and be an active participant, because you do have a voice and you do have power in the halls of your state legislature.
All righty. Thank you once again for joining us, and definitely looking forward to having you back on later on in the year, hopefully around the election time frame, and see where we're standing at that point and any progress has been made at that point. But once again, JP, thank you for joining us on RT Interviews, and keep doing what you're doing, my friend. Appreciate your efforts.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Mike. See you soon.
Have a good one.